I'm going to read from The Divine Husband, a chapter really late in the book. This chapter finds two of the main characters. The very young José Martí, who of course would go on in life to become, what's José Martí, the Cubans? Like if you can imagine one person encapsulating George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, Socrates, whatever Catholic saint you want to name, that's what José Martí ended up being to Cubans and even to a great many Latin Americans. This finds him very young at the age of 24 in 1877 when he came down to Central America, to Guatemala, from Mexico City for what would be for him a very fateful 16 months that would haunt him the rest of his life. He came down from Mexico City for two reasons. He was engaged to be married to a very aristocratic, rich Cuban woman who he'd met in Mexico City, whose father was incredibly against the match and very skeptical and thought Marti just wanted to marry his daughter for the family money. It would end up being one of the most disastrous marriages a great man, an idealistic man has ever made. If you talk about picking absolutely the wrong spouse. And he came down to Guatemala to show the family that he could earn a living on his own. And the reason he chose Guatemala was because there had just been a very radical liberal revolution there. And the liberal revolution had meant basically an attempt to legislate modernity overnight, to kick out what was basically the 300-year-old legacy of a kind of Spanish Catholic view of the world, close down the convents, expel the Jesuits, expel the archbishop, and import all this fancy French schooling kind of stuff. And Marti had been told that he, could have lots of university teaching jobs there. And when he arrived, as one of his hagiographers said, they'd never met anybody so cultured and so charming. He just electrified all of Guatemala. And as one of his hagiographers said, he was appointed in Guatemala at the university as professor of every subject, human and divine, secular and divine. He was so verbose that his nickname among Guatemalans during the time he was there was Doctor Torrente, for the torrents of verbiage that, And he was he went a little bit in the spirit that somebody, you might have known 20 years ago might have gone to Nicaragua, to see the revolution. And he was very gullible and naive. He would end up seeing through the liberal revolution. But at the beginning, he was very gullible and naive. And of course, his 16 months in Guatemala would result years later in probably what is Latin America's most famous love poem, the kind of love poem you can't imagine a 12-year-old girl anywhere in Latin America who's literate, not memorizing at some point, based on a tragic love affair he had in Guatemala with a young girl, which he stifled to go back and marry this woman. The other main character is María de las Nieves Moran, a half Guatemalan girl, the daughter of a Yankee Irish adventurer who comes down to Central America hoping to start a coffee farm and dies young. She was in the convent for a while. When the convents were closed, she was expelled out into the modern world. And she works as a translator in the British legation, and she takes José Martí's evening class at the Academia de Niñas de Centroamérica in literary composition, that art which so elevates a woman's merit. Of course, she has now more than a crush on her teacher. That's enough, and I can start. The celebrated Mexican aeronaut José Flores, conqueror of the far loftier Andean skies of Quito and Cusco, had been the first to go up in a hot air balloon over their city 20 years before, also the last. Had he succeeded that day, a modest chapter would have been added to El Gran Flores' hemispheric legend, but he would have won unambiguous glory and a lasting place in the history of the capital. His triumph would have shown the conservative Citadel's population that, despite their little country's suffocating backwardness and sullen xenophobia, they too could partake of the era's worldly marvels. The image of that potato-hued balloon floating in a radiant sky high above the bell towers and domes of their 38 churches and monasteries, might even, over time, have come to seem emblematic of the moment when the city began to change, opening to the future like a flower startled out of its timidity. Instead, the famous Mexican aeronaut flew his balloon directly into nightmares and shuddering memories and stayed there, endlessly reenacting his catastrophe in a cloudless blue sky where it hadn't rained for 20 years. At the top of Senor Flores' ascent that day, when he seemed to have attained an altitude as high as the peak of the horizon's highest volcano, where no known mortal had ever set foot, the basket he was riding in caught fire. Down in the city, across the plain, throughout the valley, and in Indian villages nestled in the surrounding hills and mountain slopes, all eyes were fixed in horror on the angry ball of fire in the middle of the sky and on the slowly sagging belly of the balloon above. Finally, the balloon collapsed, drifting sideways for a moment like a galleon in flames, and then the entire conflagration plummeted to earth, and the shocked, empty sky was left holding only a few black ribbons of smoke. And a wailing made of thousands of human cries went swirling like a wild windstorm throughout the city, innumerable small twisters of hysteria and fear charging down every street. Servants emerged from every convent, carrying trays and pitchers of chamomile tea to calm people's nerves, most rushing toward the bullfighting arena in its plaza, where the greatest number of people were gathered. The burning balloon crashed in a cornfield outside the Indian pueblo of San Pedro de las Huertas on the southern plain, and later all that was found of the famous aeronaut amid the blackened, smoldering, astonishingly reduced wreckage were carbonized bones and teeth. In the dogmatic spirit of those times, the balloonist tragedy was widely interpreted, especially from the pulpits, as divine castigation. The population's blind enthusiasm over El Gran Flores' vainglorious defiance of earthbound humility had been repaid with a spectacle of gruesome death that scattered ashes over all their mortal souls and darkened every individual conscience. Even the city's nuns, it was whispered, had abandoned their prayer choirs and run out into their convent orchards to watch the historic ascent. After that, the city lost all appetite for hot air balloon flights. But these were new times, and in honor of the Supreme President of the Liberal Revolutionary Republic's birthday, another aeronaut, also Mexican, though a far more obscure figure than his doomed predecessor of 2 decades before, Juan Rios from the small port city of Tampico, came to the capital to perform a balloon ascent that nearly anywhere else in the civilized or even semi-civilized world would be regarded as little better than a second-rate circus act. However, the resourceful Tampiqueño's flight would not lack novelty. At the peak of his ascent, he was going to drop a puppy in a silk parachute from his basket. That Sunday afternoon, Marti ran into María de las Nieves on the Calle Real, just as she was coming out from the arcade of shops along the south side of the Plaza Mayor. It took her a few seconds to collect herself. It was as if suddenly there were 2 Martis, the one who lived inside her, imprisoned inside her unhappy fixation, and this one who just stepped into her path, dressed as always in black, smiling warmly and greeting her. Because María de las Nieves was always imagining scenes between them that began with just such a chance encounter in the street, she also felt as if she'd intuitively sensed she was going to run into him just before it happened. As much as surprise, what she felt was delight in the powerful magic of her own intuition, that a love as secretive and frustrated as hers always attributes a nearly mystical significance to such mundanely coincidental encounters did not occur to her. And where was she headed, Marti wanted to know. She confessed that she hadn't quite decided where, someplace with a good vantage point from which to watch the balloon, she supposed. And where was her servant, La Señorita María Chon, Marti asked. Didn't she want to see the balloonist too? María Chon had gone home to visit her family. They were now living near Zunil, she told him. But María Chon would certainly be sorry to have missed the balloon, she said, especially when she heard about the parachuting Chuchito. Hopefully the puppy would land safely. It would be terrible if anything went wrong. She was sure he'd heard the story about what had happened the last time a balloon had gone up over the capital. Yes, he had, said Marti. He'd spoken to many people who'd witnessed the horrifying incineration in the sky as children and remained haunted by it. Hopefully today's flight and a successful landing by the parachuted puppy would ease the apparently communal burden of that terrible memory. People used to believe, said María de las Nieves, that if you heard a dog barking in the sky, that meant a new outbreak of cholera was coming, or some other apocalyptic catastrophe. That is an old Indian myth, asked Marti. An old nun's superstition, she said. I heard it in the convent. And like that, they fell into conversation, and she soon forgot all about the balloon. He'd witnessed many, dozens of such ascents, in Havana, in Spain. In Madrid, there were days when the sky was so full of balloons, it was like looking up into a celestial pear tree. There was a famous French aeronaut named Nadar, Marti told her, one of the singular characters of Paris, a friend of Baudelaire's, of Hugo's, a pioneer of the art of photography as well, the first to take photographs from the air. About 15 years before, Nadar had gone up in his famous balloon, which bore the name Le Géant, on what was intended to be a flight of world record duration. His wife and a friend or two were accompanying him as passengers, and also a dog. The party took off in Le Géant from Paris in the morning, and all day they floated over France, caught in a strong and steady eastern wind, and then it was dark. They were lost, and their watches told them it was midnight. Far ahead of the balloon's relentless path, and far below, Nadar saw lights, and he brought the balloon down as low as it was safe to, and discovered that they were the lights of a train station. And as the balloon passed over, said Marti, the great aeronaut shouted down, "Où est-ce que nous sommes?" And from below came the reply, shouted back by one of the station workers, "C'est Urkeline." Urkeline? Urkeline is in Belgium, on the border. And a little Belgian man in a uniform ran out of the station, shouting up at the balloon as it floated away, "Arrêtez, arrêtez, the passengers must disembark for their customs inspection." Marti almost never told a story simply because he thought it was funny. Had he now, just to make her laugh? She laughed, her usually murky eyes undoubtedly glowing with a girlish adoration that he couldn't have helped but notice. And Le Géant floated away into the night, Marti went on. At the train station, even when they could no longer see the balloon, they could still hear Le Chien barking in the sky. The next day, near Hanover, the balloon crashed, and all the passengers were seriously hurt and had to be hospitalized. Monsieur Nadar with 2 broken legs, and his wife with injuries even more severe. And the Chucho, she asked? Marti didn't know what had happened to the dog. He did know that later Le Géant had been put on display in the Crystal Palace in London. Such was the balloon's fame that day after day crowds had paid money just to see it. They were ambling toward the city's eastern outskirts, and Marti said the pasture behind the San Juan de Dios hospital might offer a good vantage from which to see the balloon. But they did not reach it in time. Alerted by the happy roar rising from the city, they stopped in the street and looked up over the line of trees and churches and briefly watched the puppy's descent in a parachute and the canary yellow balloon hovering far above it in the limpid blue sky. Was Marti putting María de las Nieves' reputation at risk by drawing her, alone with him, into this Sunday afternoon stroll? He would have been, had María de las Nieves been her rival, María Garcia Granados, had she belonged to a social class that at birth bestowed a pristine reputation on its females like a second soul, societal rather than divine. Marti must have been aware of that, as of lending María de las Nieves the second-hand but unsullied reputation of a girl situated somewhere between María Garcia Granados and the lower regions, where virtue was not actually required of a girl. He expressed regret that María Chon was away. María de las Nieves silently noted the remark as a kind but superfluous courtesy. But then Marti asked if he expected María Chon back by the next weekend. María de las Nieves answered that she did not expect her servant to have returned by then. Marti said that he was sorry to hear that, and now she glanced at him in puzzlement, while he tranquilly elaborated that lately he'd been thinking about that Indian chief in Zacatepeques, whom some of his liberal friends had told him about, who spoke French, read newspapers, built schools, instilled modern virtues. Marti said that he was writing a little book which he planned to publish in Mexico, to awaken readers to the qualities and riches of her little country. Wouldn't a word portrait of that Jefe Indio be a perfect advertisement for such an important aspect of the country's current transformation, the advancement of the Indian? Zacatepeques was not so far. If one left by stagecoach at dawn, perhaps rented horses once there, and had luck finding the Jefe Indio, such a señor could hardly be anything but well known, one might even be able to return late that same night. Or better yet, why not stay over? rent respectable rooms in Antigua, the old earthquake-destroyed capital, and linger the next morning to tour the reputedly magnificent ruins of the old Baroque convents and churches. And it would be prudent, Marti told her, to travel with a translator if he was going to be venturing into the villages. He knew, of course, that María de las Nieves spoke an Indian language, and that she was a translator by profession. He would be happy to hire her. He couldn't imagine a better companion for such an expedition. But he also understood that it would seem inappropriate for her to undertake such a journey in his company if she were not at least accompanied by her servant, La Señorita María Chon. Pues sí, of course, one couldn't go without María Chon, she replied in a faraway voice, for María de las Nieves still was not quite able to comprehend this incredible invitation. He wanted her to go with him to Zacatepeques, but only if she was accompanied by her servant. Was that really it? Was there anybody else who might chaperone? Amada Gomez, her boarder, a disagreeable option. At any rate, she said, I speak Mam. In Zacatepeques they mainly speak Cachiquel, no? Are they similar? I might be able to understand and make you understood, at least until we find your jefe indio. Well, then we can all speak French. He nodded in assent, as if he thought she'd meant her last remark seriously and that it hardly needed to be said. Clearly his intentions were purely professional and intellectual. It was all in service of his book. He was insisting that she be accompanied by a chaperone. Or was he waiting for her to say she would go without a chaperone? So was this the sort of moment she'd been obsessively dreaming about, suddenly enveloping her in a plausible scenario that must be one of the few she hadn't imagined? She was filled with the most extraordinary confusion, excitement, fear, a dense flock of mixed-up birds inside her. Now Marti began telling her about a treatise he'd recently read by an American archaeologist and linguist regarding the conception of love in the Native American languages. Shouldn't a people's vocabulary of love, asked Marti, reveal much about their inmost heart? For example, he told her, in the European languages, there were words for many kinds and degrees of love, but no longer words solely to express a love of the gods, such as the American languages still possessed. Apparently, the North American Indian tribes had impressively varied concepts of love, but the Nahuatl-speaking Aztecs, he said, though a more advanced culture, had had an astonishingly impoverished vocabulary of love. The Aztecs had only one basic word to express every variety of the emotion, from human to divine, chaste to carnal. And as they walked along the northern border of the pasture behind the San Juan de Dios Hospital, the amazing Marti even pronounced the word tlazoltl. And not only that, he told her, but that word shared the same verbal root as several other verbs, such as the one meaning to wear out an old garment. And all those words were descended from the Nahuatl word zo, essentially a sharp, pointed instrument used to puncture objects in flesh. And so, María de las Nieves, Marti told her, those ancient Mexican Indians apparently had verbs for to puncture and to draw blood long before they had any word for love. And this, at least in that American scientist's opinion, told ominously against their culture. But the ancient Aztecs produced no popol vuh, they left no annals of the Cachiquels, and in the language of the ancient Maya of the Yucatan. My mother was a Maya from the Yucatan, María de las Nieves interrupted, though not an ancient one, for he was confusing and making her nervous with all this talk of love, and she had to put a stop to it right now and study his words in her mind. Was he really only offering her a lesson about the Indian languages? Marti already knew that her mother was originally from the Yucatan. She told him during their conversations in the reading room kiosk, though Marti politely said, yes, of course, she is from the Yucatan, I had forgotten. Pues sí, her mother had met her Yankee father in the Yucatan, she said, and they had married, and then they had come here. And they walked in silence, as if Marti was giving her the chance to say something more about her parents if she wished, which she did not. Can you speak Yucatec Maya too, then? Marti asked. She answered no, that her mother had always preferred speaking in Spanish. The language of the Maya of the Yucatan, Marti then told her, was notably rich in concepts of love. But what is most fascinating, María de las Nieves, is that in that ancient language, all their many words for love shared the same root, ya, as their words for pain, suffering, wounds, and misery. It is as if the ancient Maya, who lived so closely to nature, developed the same romantic ideas about the relationship between love and suffering as so many centuries later did the poets of Paris and London. I see. People suffer too much over all of that, don't they? Bastante. She turned her head to the side, briefly closing her eyes in mortified self-reproach. Marti repeated, yes, bastante, a word meaning both quite a lot and more than enough. His gaze coasting over the ground, he hadn't noticed her embarrassment. He must be thinking of her rival, Maria Garcia Granados, she suddenly thought. And now, when he looked back at her, she sensed, like a shadow rising inside of him, that Maria Garcia Granados was about to darken her day, that he was on the verge of confiding his feelings for the other girl to her, and silently she begged him not to. But instead, he told her that in the Quiche and Cachiquel dialects, logo was the word for love, and that in both it also meant to buy. But that is not as ominous in its implications as it sounds, María de las Nieves, said Marti, for such words derive from the worthy sentiment to value highly. Doesn't the word caris, the ipsum verbum amoris, as Cicero called it, mean both expensive and beloved? The English, of course, say dear, which can sound very tender, but also so distressed and pecuniary. How do you say love and ma'am? Like Jill, she answered. They had turned the corner of a row of small pines and were on an old cow and mule train path descending between a cafetal with coffee shrubs shaded by banana trees and a steep dirt slope from which swallows were darting and swooping. The dirt path wound gently down to a river valley running through the deep ravines of the mountain plateau. It was one of those late October afternoons when the temperature and even fragrance of the air seemed to belong to a climate of apples and pumpkins rather than to one of coffee and bananas. But Pepe, she asked, are you sure that Jefe Indio really exists? Thanks.